On the line here we have Hal Wooding from Wooding Geospatial Solutions. Hal Wooding is a director of Wooding Geospatial Solutions based in Durban. They've also got an office in Calgary, Canada. Now, he's an interesting character because he has a BSc in agricultural engineering. Not only that, but he knows how to fly a plane, not only the ones with the flappy wings, but also fixed wing ones. Hal has served as chair for the South African Association of Air Survey Companies for 10 years, and is a member of the American Society for Photogrammetry and Remote Sensing. He's also a member of the KwaZulu-Natal University Land Survey Advisory Board. So Hal is known as a geospatial problem solver, and he's very much into quality improvement and so on. Now, Corin and I spent some time on the phone with Hal in scoping this talk, and what we came out with was that we're not asking Hal to go into the network planning connection to remote sensing completely. We are asking him to demonstrate its capabilities. And why are we asking him to demonstrate its capabilities? Well, because if you've been in load research for a while and in planning for a while, you'll know that you can't escape GIS and GIS resources. And where do GIS resources come from and what are their capabilities? Well, that's exactly the kind of thing that somebody like Hal can tell us. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Hal. Welcome to you, Hal.
Okay, thanks, Marcus. All right, let me try and share my screen. Yeah, thanks again, and good afternoon, everyone. Okay, so yes, as Marcus said, I've titled my presentation Advances in Remote Sensing, Aerial Survey and Geospatial Data Acquisition for Planning Applications. So what I am trying to do is I'm going to give an overview of most of the remote sensing technologies. So we'll briefly cover drones, aerial photography, satellite, thermal, LiDAR, and a bit on artificial intelligence and deep learning as well. I'm going to try and give a few applications and the pros and cons of each. And yeah, and I think if anyone has any questions, we'll have a Q&A session at the end. So to kick off, I would like to just add a little background about myself, further to what Marcus said. I've always loved aircraft. And when I was at school, I used to hang out at Virginia Airport, and I met an aerial survey crew. And from time to time, I would get to hitch a ride. And over time, I got to learn how to use the equipment. And it eventually ended up where I used to stand in for the operator, the standard operator, from time to time during school holidays. And that eventually ended up as a university vac job. So in those days, you had a navigation site and you looked down to see what you were taking photographs of, and you used it to control the camera. So you had to level the camera and set the drifts and rotate it so that it kept on line. And yeah, looking back at Hans' moments, when you were dripping sweat in the back and clinging to the nav site so that you didn't come crashing down on it in the turbulence, and then from time to time you'd have to take your eyes off it so that you could vomit into a bag. But all in all, yeah, quite a good experience. Yeah, my dad's a land surveyor as well, so he got me involved, and I ended up joining his firm after I finished university. Yeah, so like I was saying, so nowadays obviously the navigation systems are very, very different. Like Marcus said, we've got two offices at the moment, one in Canada and one in South Africa, and we're hoping to open a third in the UK once the world stabilizes a little bit. We typically don't do big projects. I mean, it sounds very grand, but we're actually a very small company. Yeah, we don't do big projects. We focus on the smaller ones. Our clients typically don't know what they're looking for. They just need a solution, and then we work with them to develop something that works. We focus a lot on our own R&D, and we often end up learning on the job as we go. But yeah, our clients need help, and we guide them, advise them through the process of problem solving. Okay, so there are currently 3 main platforms for aerial data acquisition: satellite, traditional airborne, and UAV, and each one has some overlap with the other. So there's a bit of a gray area between each. I'm going to start with UAVs because I don't think that they have much applicability to what you guys do, but they are all the rage and will be the standard one of these days, and so they definitely need a mention. So drones have obviously been a huge disruptive force in the aerial data acquisition industry, and have completely changed where we can collect data and how we collect it. And they're also presenting an incredible opportunity to get a perspective on projects in a way that's never been possible in the past. But as with any new technology, there's some challenges, and it's going to take time for them to stabilize. I'm not going to discuss the ins and outs of UAVs for the reasons I've already mentioned, but they typically, at this stage, well suited to small areas, high resolution. So we're talking like 1 centimeter to 10 centimeter GSD, and areas of up to like a few hundred hectares. That said, people are using them for bigger areas, but the economics don't really work out anymore. And it really is a little bit of the gee wow getting ahead of itself. And drone-based LiDAR is also starting to become a thing, but again, very small sites. In terms of where drones are going, I couldn't resist putting this photo in. So obviously on the good side, the payloads are getting smaller and lighter, and the drones are getting bigger and more capable, and the range and endurance are increasing, and the legislation is being formalized. I put there the reliability can be improved, because obviously if you're going to put a few million rands worth of sensor into an unmanned aerial vehicle, you would like to be pretty certain it's coming back. That graph on the left there is the US military drone crashes per year. I don't think it's really increasing. I just think the number of drone flights is increasing. In terms of the bigger drones and where it's going, so this is the LT Reach, which is developed locally. And so already it's no problem to spend $300,000 or $400,000 on a drone of this sort of size, and which is comparable to aircraft prices. But that said, you know, the purchase cost is going to be offset by lower running costs. The fact that you don't need a conventional pilot who costs a lot of money to train up a drone pilot. It's considerably cheaper to train a drone pilot. So with time, we can expect that the drone surveys are going to become more and more, and it will continue to play a bigger part in aerial data acquisition. But right at the moment, they're not so well suited to wide area data collection. Okay, satellite imaging. So just to cover a few of the basics, I think that satellite imaging probably is well suited to what you guys do. So I'll cover a few of the advances in that. We frequently get requests for satellite imagery, and it's become a bit of a colloquial term for any small scale imagery. So a lot of traditional aerial photography just gets called satellite photography. This is especially also in the States, where everyone's used to using like Google Earth, and Google Earth has got lots of aerial photography in it, and to be able to think it's satellite imagery. In reality, satellite imagery is suited to a very specific set of parameters. But before we get onto that, I just want to go through a few of the pros and cons. So obviously, they've been collecting data now for many years, and there's an archive of 20 to 40 years of data that can be accessed. Because they acquire data all the time, it can be bought off the shelf. You just swipe your credit card and off you go. You don't have to wait. And then importantly, they are repeatable. So you get the same coverage every time that you want it. And it's radiometrically calibrated, so it looks exactly the same. Disadvantages, resolution. So typically small scale. The highest resolution commercial satellites are 30 centimeter, and then it's extremely expensive. And then if you're tasking a satellite, the weather and time of day can be a problem, because the satellite can only pass over you once every few days or even weeks, depending on the orbit. So you only kind of get one shot at it. I think that the latest trends in satellite imaging is probably not so much the improvement in the sensors, but rather the way the data is accessed and the development of better ways to leverage the data. This is an example of high-resolution satellite imagery. So this is 30 centimeter digital globe imagery from Auckland. So it gives you an idea of what is possible. Costs of satellite imagery. So as you can see, the 30 centimeter resolution is very expensive. And there's basically a linear relationship between resolution and cost. And this graph that I've done here goes down to 6 meters. But when you get above 6 meters, so 10 meters and above, it's often freely available. Turning to applications, obviously land use mapping is one of the primary applications for satellite imagery. And so this is an urban land use map, quite high detailed, so sort of 50 centimeter type resolution, but only a few classes. This next example is 30 centimeter. This happens to be Cape Town. So this is 30 centimeter resolution with a lot more classes. This is an example of change mapping. So this is a project we conducted a couple of years ago for monitoring sugarcane harvest. So this is free Sentinel data that we used to do it. And there's a new acquisition that comes around every 2 weeks, which you can download. And so the object of the exercise was first to map out all the sugarcane fields and then monitor their harvest through the season. The reason for that is that the milling season is very defined, and the miller needs to know how much cane still needs to be harvested to make sure he gets it all in time. So this last picture in the sequence here with the fields colored is actually colored by date, harvest date. So obviously the accuracy of the data is within 2 weeks. Okay, artificial intelligence and deep learning has probably been the one area which has seen the greatest leaps in the last few years. So the same technology is applicable to aerial imagery, but it's because of the availability of satellite data that so much work has been done on it. So the techniques used in AI are very different to the past or classical segmentation. So you can use segmentation with artificial intelligence as well. But the whole approach is a little bit back to front. So when you're using artificial intelligence, you typically use chips of imagery which represent what you're going to throw at the engine ultimately. And some will contain the targets that you're looking for, and some will not. So you will seed it with the chips and say, well, these chips have got the target in, and these chips do not. And then the algorithm will go and look for all the areas which have got the target. So this type of procedure has been used successfully to count everything from whales and caribou to cars and buildings. There are 2 major AI platforms available. One is Amazon SageMaker, and the other one is Google Earth Engine, which is what I've got on the screen at the moment. They both have an access to a huge archive of satellite imagery, going back basically to the beginning of time. And a lot of the data and tools have been made public in the interest of furthering science. So I'm going to go through a few examples of where AI has been used. So enumerating buildings is fairly straightforward for an AI engine. So counting, and then so on the left, that's an urban area, obviously, where the buildings have been counted. You can also extract the size, sort of number of square meters of a building, and basic dimensions, so length and width as well. You do that by applying a segmentation approach after your initial neural network has identified the buildings. Like on the right, it is a rural area where the AI engine was seeded just with looking for huts, so thatch type huts, and it's marked them all down. All right, this is an example of looking for vehicles. So here again, you seed it with chips, which will show whether it has a vehicle or not. You can get out the color of the vehicle, the approximate size of the vehicle, and then obviously the count. This exact approach was used, interestingly, to study the number of cars in Walmart parking lots in the States. About 2 years ago, they did the study. And the idea was to correlate the number of cars in the parking lot to share price. Same approach, counting aircraft. Very, very similar idea, so counting aircraft at airports. This was an interesting one. So the oil bulk oil storage facilities have got floating tops to keep gases out. By seeing how full where the top of the shadow, by looking at the shadow, you can estimate how full your bulk storage tank is. So then what they did is they took lots of chips of bulk storage tanks and categorized them as either being full, half full, or empty. And then they ran this across the entire United States. And again, it was for the futures price for Brent crude. Okay, different type of satellite application is synthetic aperture radar. So quite a lot of research has been going into this in recent years. And it's mainly because it is an active sensor. So it's a little bit like LiDAR in that it transmits its own signal. So it's not dependent on weather or the time of day. And while it doesn't give you a traditional picture, and what you see there on the left is a reflectivity image, by comparing the interference patterns of successive passes, it's possible to perform some very accurate change detection. So this is called interferometry or INSAR. And it's even been used by some of the more remote mines to measure changes in stockpile volumes. So that sometimes makes people think that you can calculate heights or volumes from SAR, but that's not true. It only measures change. So if you know the volume beforehand, you can infer the volume after, but you can't make direct measurements about heights or volumes. This is a very recent application of SAR, or developing application of SAR. So there's a new startup called Capella Space, and they're in the process of launching 36 low-orbit SAR satellites. And the aim is to provide a repeat rate of 1 hour. So this is an example of a port in the Netherlands captured at 1 hour intervals. And you can see the movement of the cranes and the ships over the 3 hours. So this is going to bring about all sorts of new possibilities. Okay, so now I want to come back to traditional aerial survey. And yeah, there's no doubt there's a lot of pressure on it. Satellites from one side and drones from the other. So it really is the piggy in the middle. But for now, it still occupies a significant segment of the market. If you need large areas acquired at high resolution, or if you need LiDAR, fixed wing is still the only way. So that's a photograph of our LiDAR installed in an aircraft. So when it's all fully set up like that, it weighs about 30 kilos. So it's not going to fit. It can't really be reduced. I mean, Obviously, as things develop, it will get smaller and lighter. But for now, it's a big chunk of metal, and it's not going to fit into a drone very easily. So this is a cost comparison graph between satellite and aerial photography. So I've used 30 centimeter satellite, which is the most expensive, and compared it to 30 centimeter aerial. So the blue line represents the 30 centimeter satellite. The yellow is the 30 centimeter aerial, and the gray line is the 30 centimeter aerial, and the yellow line is 10 centimeter aerial, which I've just given for reference. So what you can see is that there's a base cost in getting a fixed wing aircraft into the air. And whether you go for 10 centimeter or 30 centimeter, the costs are very similar, up to about 15 square kilometers, and it comes in at 20 to 30,000 Rand. At about 60 square kilometers, it's no longer cheaper to use satellite, and you'd be better off using aerial. And then at about 900 square kilometers, you can actually acquire 10 centimeter imagery for the same price as satellite. Now, I haven't taken into account any discounts at the satellite providers. They don't publish discounts, but if you go to them and you ask for very big areas, they will certainly give them to you. But given their pricing structure, it's just interesting. In terms of LiDAR, I wouldn't say that the technology has changed much, and I think everyone is probably well aware of what it can do and has used it for encroachment studies and measuring catenary lines, and all that kind of thing can already be done automatically. The sensors are obviously becoming bigger and are able to acquire higher point densities. And there are new technologies on the horizon, such as Geiger mode or single photon LiDARs. And those promise unprecedented levels of detail, but they still seem to be pretty far off. There's some basic problems with them at the moment. I've done a graph of basic LiDAR costs, just again out of interest. So prices normally come in at around 35,000 Rand for small sites that are close to base, and then they go up from there. And this is completely dependent on the resolution and accuracy and all that kind of thing. But this gives an idea of kind of a mid-range LiDAR survey. There's been huge demand in the last year or two or three for LiDAR surveys for wind farm planning. So we've been fortunate enough to be involved in quite a lot of that. One of the areas that is benefiting from the higher point densities that modern sensors give is 3D modeling. So you can automatically use the point cloud to extract wireframes of the buildings, and it's a very efficient process. And then the wireframes can be used for calculating heating and cooling, volumetric studies. You can work out your PV efficiencies from the pitch and orientation. And then also these wireframe models are used for input into digital twins, which I'm going to come to shortly. I should also mention semi-global matching. So semi-global matching is using imagery to generate a LiDAR type point cloud, and it leverages the power of modern GPUs. So you can get right down to a single point per pixel. So if you can imagine a 10 centimeter image, that would give you 100 points per square meter, which in LiDAR terms is unprecedented. It's just extremely high. But with drones, this is often the approach that they will take with drones, because there are not many LiDAR-based drones around. They're coming, but mostly what you get from drones is an SGM solution. People forget that SGM is from photo, and so it it's still not LiDAR. It's a surface model, goes over the top of trees and bushes and things like that. And you also get a lot of averaging. So corners of buildings are like curved. You can often see it in an image that's been generated from SGM type processes. You get like wiggles along the sides of the corners of the buildings and things. This shows a difference between SGM and LiDAR through vegetation. So the gray points are LiDAR through that valley, and then the SGM goes over the top. So the SGM is very dense. That's the blue points. The LiDAR is sparse. It's the gray points, but you get the penetration down into that little valley there. Okay. One of the new technologies that semi-global matching has been able to enable is this creation of digital twins. So with digital twins, you would use a multi-camera setup, and you use an SGM type process from multiple cameras to get a 3D realization of the scene. So this is a 3D model of Pietermaritzburg that we did a little while back. That's what the camera system looks like. So you have 5 cameras in the principal directions, looking forward, backwards, left, right, and down. And the idea is to capture not just the tops, you capture all the facades of the buildings and then reconstruct that. Ideally, you would like to have the area flown with high accuracy LiDAR as well, and that's to catch all those corners that I spoke about before, and to get underneath the vegetation, and then you just color the trees on top. In creating 3D city models, there are some challenges. So in urban canyons, you obviously cannot get your 3D view from the air, and in those areas you need to fly drones, and then you bring your drone imagery into your model, and in some instances you even have to drive as well, and you'll drive with a multi-camera setup, kind of like a Google Street View cars, and you drive the roads, and then you integrate that into your 3D model. So this is all used to create a digital twin, and in first world countries, these are gaining a lot of interest, and although they are excessively expensive to create, there's a lot of it going on now. The next technology is thermal imaging. So aerial thermal isn't really a new technology, but the processing has been improving and the sensors are getting bigger, although very slowly. Thermal sensors are very sensitive, and they're able to detect temperature to within 0.01 of a degree. And they're quite well suited to a number of applications. We've conducted a few thermal surveys for the coal dumps, and also searching for underground fires. Underground coal fires. This is a thermal imaging of a city, and we've started doing a bit of this in Canada with a local company there called ITRIS, who have developed a larger thermal sensor. And they have been deploying it to measure heat loss in buildings. Obviously in Canada, there's a direct correlation between how thermally insulated our houses and what the energy demand is. The thermal image is converted to a simple efficiency index for each house, and then this is made public, and it gives prospective home buyers the ability to be able to see how thermally insulated a house is, and so what the energy consumption will be like, and it also gives authorities the ability to provide incentives to homeowners to upgrade the insulation in their house. And obviously with thermal, you don't just have to, it doesn't just need to be used to measure heat. You can use it to measure coolth as well, or cooling. So in Sydney, a couple of years ago, they had a bylaw that high-rise buildings needed to set their air conditioners to ambient at night. And they did a pilot project when they flew the city with thermal, and all the buildings that had a nice blue halo around them were in trouble. Thermal's also been used for utilities mapping, but in order to do this, you need a really good temperature gradient. So it's mostly been used to detect hot pipes in cold climates. Okay, last section. I was specifically asked about solar panel enumeration. So I think if anyone's done some research on this, you would have come across the widely publicized Deep Solar project that was done in 2018, 2019 by Stanford University. So in that project, they used artificial intelligence to develop a neural network to basically try and find the panels. And they used 370,000 100-foot by 100-foot chips, image chips, to train the model. And the chips were marked as either positive or negative. And then they ran a segmentation on the positive chips to determine the dimensions of each solar panel field. And it was done from 30 centimeter satellite imagery. When the model was tested, they found it to be 90% accurate, and ultimately they ran it on 48 states to count 1.47 million solar panel installations. So it can definitely be done and automated. And moreover, the Deep Solar project, they published all their research, the algorithms, the training data, so that others could replicate their project. It would, however, take a little bit of legwork to apply it to a South African context. So the satellite imagery in the US is substantially better than what we have here. You could use aerial imagery, and most municipalities have that available, but it's not from a single source, and it's different ages and different resolutions. And so if you were to use aerial imagery, each city would need individual seed data, which is what takes most of the time. So if you think that Stanford University used 370,000 chips, if that's what you need to train a model, you would need basically that to train for each city. Also, we couldn't. The Stanford data might not be applicable to South Africa because our buildings look slightly different. But in a nutshell, it could definitely be done. And that's it. Thank you very much. Yeah, I hope it's provided a little bit of interest.
Hal, thank you very much. This is quite an eyeful from a sort of a researcher and a planner's point of view. I can see there's huge potential here. I see hands are starting to go up. Let us take the questions one at a time. I would like to specifically ask the network planning guys here for their views and their needs from what has been demonstrated. Corin, let's go with you.
Thank you. Thanks, Al. Very interesting showing the visuals and what's available. My question at this stage is just simply, please explain what you mean by using so many thousand chips. The concept of the chips is a little bit strange to me. So please just explain what you mean by using those chips.
Okay, so if we use the solar panel monitoring as example, they divided images up into 100-foot by 100-foot squares, and each square is called a chip, and the chips were marked as being positive or negative depending on whether they had panels in or not, and that is used as the training data.
Okay, thanks. So basically, it's using existing aerial photography visuals and then saying, okay, in this block, what is the solar panel and what isn't?
Yeah. So it's very much a system of saying, well, these are the knowns, and giving them to the computer, saying these are the knowns, learn from them, and then go and tell me what the unknowns are.
Yeah, that would be your traditional training environment for NN and so on.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. I know that our colleagues in Stellenbosch University, Cape Town, and Durban have been very much involved in projects to get some value out of aerial identification. Vasu, I see your hand up. Would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Hal, for the presentation.
Yes.
So basically, my first question is the deep solar projects. We do have a lot of residential properties that are installing solar panels, and we're trying to, obviously, a lot of them are not coming to us and getting these approved, right? So in terms of actually determining or running a study to figure out, who has these solar panels, how much would that take, or what would it take, for us to carry out a study like that?
Yeah, so I mean, it can definitely be done. Most of the large municipalities have got pretty good imagery. I don't know about the other centres, but I mean, I know Durban was done in 2018, and I think it's being done again this year. So yeah, that would be the imagery to use, and then it would be a matter of training a model and letting it run. It wouldn't. I don't think it would be an enormous job.
Okay. Okay, and then the next one is where we've tried to use satellite imageries on the encroachment side, where we've got overhead lines and we've got cables, underground cables as well. We know exactly where our lines and cables are. We've got that on GIS. So we did have one presentation from CSIR, where they were able to, well, they came to us and they said they've got live, they can track the pictures live, right? Or more or less live. So they could more or less tell us when, let's say, for instance, a servitude was being encroached, right? And possibly, then we could actually send people out there and have a look. How is something done like that,
I don't know.
Yeah, because they said they initially, basically they said they were looking at that technology for tracking of fires and so on, wildfires.
Yeah, so sure. No, I'm not sure. There are so many of these kind of technologies out there. It would be difficult to know which one. So for the tracking of fires, they normally use quite low resolution thermal satellites or thermally sensitive satellites. So sort of 10 meters, and I can't see how that would work for encroachment studies. For encroachment, I would expect that the synthetic aperture radar route would be the best suited, because you can basically measure the change. You would measure the change in roughness of the signal. So when the signal goes into the bush, it scatters, and you can measure that. So as the bush encroaches, you would be able to measure the change. But I don't know about live. So synthetic aperture radar, I know I think you can get daily at the moment. So yeah, you could certainly check it daily, which maybe is good enough to call live in this kind of problem.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks. One of the things that is obviously of great interest to municipalities is tracking solar rooftop systems and then joining that information together with their other data about the registration of these rooftop systems to better understand the planning implications. Do you have any idea of the accuracy of what the deep solar was coming through with? I'm talking about the sizing parameters of these panels.
No, I don't have the data on the sizing of the panels. In terms of reconciling it to permits, you would need to have the address information. So you could correlate an automatic process of finding the panels. You could correlate to addresses, And as long as you've got the addresses with the permit information, you could do the cross-referencing. But yeah, in terms of the accuracy of the sizing, I don't have that information.
It's of interest because this is a problem in terms of the management of the registrations.
Yes.
Perhaps Ntito can jump in here. They seem to have customers who are installing these systems, but not letting the authorities know that it's happened. And so there's a whole issue there about getting back to these customers and almost normalizing those installations after the fact. And perhaps parameterizing them would help as well. Ntito, you're welcome to jump in.
Yeah, look, in our regard, it's been basically donkey work in terms of an area gets reviewed physically based on the area photography that's available, and we check it against our records whether the person has applied or is in the process of getting an approval for a PV system or not. And then notices get issued by particularly switching off those people up until they comply or they start to submit paperwork of compliance, and a fine gets issued to them. Additionally, I have basically an interest with regards to counting shacks in a particular area with regards to electrification. Because majority of these, they get invaded, and sometimes we get expected to provide services without knowing how many dwellings you're looking for. I know that it's sometimes not accurate, but if there's some way to be able to count how many there are, additional is not a problem based on the informal settlement keeps on growing, regardless whether there's space or not. So whatever additional capacity gets built in, where a roof has been counted that's not actually a roof, is a plus sign with regards that the person can be connected without any further reinforcing of the network.
Yeah. So counting the huts and shacks, that's a fairly elementary process that can be done. And on the PV panels, checking whether a building has a PV panel or not is fairly straightforward. What would be challenging is they've applied for a permit for 5 and they've installed 10. I think that would be very difficult.
And Ntito, just to be clear, are you when you say donkey work, does that mean that you employ students to sort of do photo interpretation on the GIS and work through it block by block, or is it some other technique used?
Yeah, I think on our side, I think customer services staff gets used to have a look at this, but I'm not sure, as I'm not driving that particular process, but there is someone who looks at it at a particular area, and sometimes they may use GIS staff to try and write a Python script to actually try and automate it. How far that has went, I'm not sure at this stage.
Okay, thanks. That's very interesting. There is often an approach to sort of do sweatshop on this kind of thing, where you get some staff members that don't complain too much, and then you put them onto it, and they click away. Karen, go ahead.
Thank you. Mine is just a question again. Hal, you had on, I think it was slide 31, where you compared like the LiDAR versus the camera and the spots and so on. I'd like to understand that graph a little bit better, please. If you can perhaps bring that one up and just explain to us, does it mean that the LiDAR can see the valley, whereas the camera only sees the roof of the trees, or what does it actually mean?
Canopy versus canyon.
Yeah, that was my interpretation, but I'd just like to have a proper interpretation.
Okay, can you see the slide?
Yes, thank you.
All right, so the blue dots were measured from semi-global matching from imagery, and the gray dots are LiDAR points, and it follows that yellow line that goes through that little valley. So it's a cross-section along the yellow line. So in the sort of cross-section below, where the blue goes over the top of the trees and everything else, the grey dots are descending into the true ground, which is well below. the canopy.
Okay, thanks. But now on the same distance, you get the grey dots right down in the valley and on top. Is it sort of like where it's quite narrow and it's catching the side of the valley and the bottom, or what does that actually mean? What the scattered grey dots?
Oh, I see. Yeah. So the grey dots along the bottom are the valley floor, and the rest is vegetation. So it's reflections off vegetation. It's this.
Okay.
So it's not. This isn't classified by return. I probably should have coloured it by return number. So the last return would be along the floor of the valley, and the other grey dots, kind of below the blue line, would be intermediate returns. And then the ones above the blue line. So the grey dots that fall above the blue line are where it's actually caught. So those would be first returns from the LiDAR pulse, and where it is catching the tall little bits of vegetation which have been averaged out when you have done it from imagery. So that was that averaging effect I was talking about when you do matching from image.
Thanks a lot. Now I understand it much better. Thanks.
Okay.
Okay, so Hal, this is also an indication almost of biomass if you look at the depth.
Yes, so I mean, LiDAR is used a lot for biomass calculations. So we do a lot of forestry type applications, and specifically for biomass. And you can count the individual trees. So we do that as well. So for forestry companies, when we fly with LiDAR, we will give them a stem count per compartment, as well as the height of the tree and the crown diameter, the maximum crown diameter, and the average crown diameter. So for we provide that data for every tree when we do a forestry project.
Okay, the parameterization of your photography sounds like it would have a lot of application in the built environment as well. I think it's just an analog of the same thing, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Okay. Just a comment to Justice. We were talking about solar panels, Justice. From a Stellenbosch point of view, I know that you've done solar system identification. Can you comment on how those panels were picked up from a Stellenbosch point of view? Okay, I have no response from Justice. Colleagues, any further questions for Hal? We've got a leader of aerial sensing here. Now's the time to ask the questions. Okay, folks, I believe that we are at the end. Hal, many thanks from my side for presenting to us today. It's been quite an eye-opener. I really appreciated your overview of the different types of sensing that are available and the advances that are being made in it. And again, once more, a vote of thanks from our side. It has been
From
very
my side
enlightening.
as well, thank you. Thank you very much, Hal. It just opens your mind a little bit to what is available and what technologies can actually be used, and sometimes it's good to just take yourself out of what you're used to and see what's available out there and start thinking as to how those technologies can be used.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Karen, and thank you, Marcus, as well.
And we're getting thanks in the chat box from Vasu and from Tsulani as well, and from Maki. An amusing story from my side. I was recently looking in dark night at what I thought was a porcupine, and this thing charged me, but I was using an infrared scope and I could not see it at all. So there was not enough temperature variation to pick this thing up on an infrared scope, and I had this noise charging me out of the darkness. So one must always test these technologies to make sure they work properly.
That's amazing.
Anyway, So, gents, thank you. That's it from my side. And Hal, again, much appreciate your presentation. Thank you.
All right, good.
Cheers.
Cheers.